What would you do if you caught your husband stealing $100,000 from your savings in the dead of night, only to discover he'd spent it on a secret life and a vintage piano tied to your deepest heartbreak? In a single moment, my world shattered, leaving me torn between rage and a haunting question. Was this betrayal or a twisted act of love? Dive into this roller coaster of deception and redemption, and if you're as gripped as I was, hit that subscribe button. Let's reach 1,000 subscribers together and uncover more shocking truths. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of our modern Seattle home, casting golden streaks across the granite kitchen island where I stood, stirring my tea. The aroma of chamomile mingled with the faint bitterness of my husband Daniel's black coffee as he sat across from me, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding mine. After 15 years of marriage, I thought I knew every nuance of Daniel Harper's expressions. The way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought, the slight smirk when he was teasing me. But lately, something had shifted. Something I couldn't quite name, but felt like a shadow creeping into our carefully curated life. Ellie, I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Daniel said, his voice clipped as he set down his coffee mug with deliberate precision. I'm your husband, not some financial predator. All I'm asking is why you won't add me to your new investment account. I kept my tone even, though my pulse quickened. We've always maintained transparency with our finances, Dan. That's how we've worked. So why the secrecy now? First the locked phone, then the private email account, and now separate investments? It doesn't add up. He sighed dramatically, a sound I had grown accustomed to in the past 6 months, a sound that grated on me more with each passing day. It's just a small side portfolio I'm experimenting with, he said, his tone softening into something almost patronizing. You've never shown much interest in investment strategy before. Suddenly, you're concerned about asset allocation? I held his gaze, the sunlight illuminating the growing distance between us. I'm concerned about the secretiveness, Dan. These aren't the actions of someone with nothing to hide. His face hardened, the warmth in his hazel eyes replaced by something colder. After 15 years, I think I've earned a little privacy. If you can't trust me with something as basic as managing some investments without your supervision, maybe we have bigger problems. He stood abruptly, grabbing his leather jacket from the back of the chair. I'm late for work. We can continue this conversation about your trust issues another time. The front door closed with a decisive click, leaving me alone with my cooling tea and a knot of unease in my stomach. I stared at the empty space where he'd sat, replaying his words in my mind. Privacy? Trust issues? This wasn't the Daniel I'd married, the charming, ambitious man I met at a financial technology conference 16 years ago. The man who'd shared my appreciation for careful planning and mutual respect. We'd built a life together, a comfortable one, if not always passionate. No children, by choice, just 2 careers that demanded our focus. Mine as a risk management consultant for a major insurance firm, his as a financial tech consultant with a growing reputation in Seattle's tech scene. But 6 months ago, something had changed. Subtle at first, a locked phone here, a late night at the office there, but unmistakable. And now, this argument. My name is Eleanor Harper, Ellie to those who know me best, 43 years old, and I've built my career on identifying potential threats before they materialize. My colleagues call me Ellie the Eagle for my sharp instincts, my ability to spot trouble on the horizon. Ironic, then, that I'd been so blind to the cracks forming in my own marriage. I pulled out my laptop from the drawer beneath the kitchen island, my fingers trembling slightly as I logged into our joint accounts. The balances were still healthy. No unusual withdrawals, no red flags at first glance. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for Dan's newfound secrecy. But then my phone buzzed on the counter, jolting me out of my thoughts. A text from an unknown number. Be careful with your husband. He's not who you think he is. The words stared up at me, stark and menacing against the bright screen, my breath caught in my throat. Who sent this? Was it a prank? A disgruntled colleague of Dan's? My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them eased the cold dread settling in my chest. I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. No name, no clue. I sat there for a long moment, the silence of the house pressing in around me. My tea had gone cold, forgotten on the counter. I couldn't shake the feeling that this message was a warning, a crack in the facade of our perfect life. I opened my banking app again, this time digging deeper into our joint accounts, looking for anything I might have missed. That's when I saw it. A $5,000 transfer from our joint savings to an organization I'd never heard of, Hope for Tomorrow. A quick Google search revealed it was a charity focused on cancer research, but the website was vague, the details sparse. Dan had never mentioned this. We always discussed major expenses, even charitable ones. Why would he keep this from me? My mind flashed back to a conversation a few weeks ago when I'd casually asked about some irregular charges on our joint credit card. Work expenses, he'd said dismissively. The company reimburses me, nothing for you to worry about. I'd trusted him then, despite the faint alarm bells in my head. But now, those bells were ringing louder, impossible to ignore. I stood and paced the kitchen, the hardwood floor cool beneath my bare feet. My career had taught me to trust my instincts, to follow the patterns, to look for the anomalies. And Dan's behavior was an anomaly. A series of small, inexplicable shifts that were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. I glanced at my phone again, the cryptic text still glowing on the screen. Whoever sent it knew something I didn't, and I needed to find out what. I opened the app for our home security system, a precaution I had insisted on after a string of break-ins in our neighborhood last year. Dan had rolled his eyes at the expense, but I'd held firm. It's about protecting what's ours, I'd told him. Now, I was grateful for my paranoia. I scrolled through the footage from the past few nights, my heart pounding as I landed on a clip from 4:13 a.m. the previous night. There he was, Daniel, standing over my desk in the dim glow of his phone screen, photographing my personal banking documents. His movements were methodical, deliberate, as if he'd done this before. The blue light illuminated his face, casting harsh shadows that made him look like a stranger. I watched the clip again, my stomach churning. This wasn't just secrecy, this was betrayal. I sank into a chair, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me. My husband of 15 years was stealing my financial information in the dead of night. Why? What was he planning? And who had sent that text? The questions swirled in my mind, each one sharper than the last. I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't confront him yet, not until I had more answers, more evidence. I needed to protect myself, just as I'd always done. My mother's words echoed in my memory, a mantra she'd repeated after my parents' marriage collapsed in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Always have your own safety net, Ellie, she'd said, her voice hollow with regret, no matter how much you love someone. I'd taken her advice to heart, maintaining my own accounts even after marrying Dan. We shared joint finances for household expenses, but my personal savings, investments, and retirement funds were mine alone. Dan had similar arrangements, a system that had worked for us, balancing togetherness with independence, until now. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for my bank's fraud department, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. Whatever Dan was planning, I would be ready. I had to be, because if there was one thing I'd learned in my career and in life, it was that the greatest risks often came from the people closest to you. I sat frozen in my office chair, the security footage looping on my laptop screen like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Daniel, my husband of 15 years, rifling through my personal banking documents at 4:13 a.m., his face illuminated by the cold blue light of his phone. Each frame felt like a dagger, slicing through the fragile trust I'd clung to. The man I'd shared my life with, the man who'd stood beside me through every milestone, was betraying me in the dead of night. My hands trembled as I closed the laptop, but my mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments of the past 6 months. Every locked phone, every vague excuse, every late night at the office that now felt like a lie. My name is Eleanor Harper, Ellie to those who know me best. And I've spent my career as a risk management consultant, trained to spot patterns of fraud and deception before they spiral into disaster. But this wasn't a corporate case I could solve with spreadsheets and audits. This was my marriage, my home, my heart. And yet the instincts that had earned me the nickname Ellie the Eagle at work were screaming now, louder than ever. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing my temples as memories flooded in. Memories I'd buried deep but could never fully escape. My parents' marriage had crumbled in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, a slow, massive disaster that began with my father's risky investments and ended with everything we owned stripped away. I was 16 when we sold the house, the furniture, even my mother's prized possession, a vintage Steinway piano, a wedding gift from my grandfather to her. That piano had been her sanctuary, her escape, the one thing that brought her joy through every hardship. She'd play Chopin's nocturnes on Sunday evenings, her fingers dancing over the keys as I sat cross-legged on the floor, mesmerized. "This piano holds our love, Ellie," she'd say, her smile soft and wistful. "It's proof that beauty can survive anything." But it didn't survive. The day the movers took it away, I watched my mother break. She didn't cry. She never cried in front of me. But her eyes went hollow, her laughter faded. She slipped into a depression so deep that even my father's apologies couldn't reach her. A year later, my parents divorced. 2 years after that, my mother was gone. The heart attack, the doctor said, but I knew it was more than that. It was grief, the kind that eats you from the inside. Before she passed, she'd pulled me close, her voice barely a whisper. "Always have your own safety net, Ellie," she said. "No matter how much you love someone." I'd taken her words to heart, building my life around that principle. Even after marrying Daniel, I'd kept my personal accounts separate. Savings, investments, retirement funds, all in my name alone. We shared joint accounts for household expenses and major purchases, but I'd always had my safety net, just as Daniel had his. It was a system that worked for us. Or so I'd thought. Now, staring at the frozen image of him photographing my banking information, I realized how naive I'd been to think that love alone could shield me from betrayal. I stood and paced the room, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The house felt too quiet, too empty, as if it knew something I didn't. I pulled out my phone, hesitating before opening our joint account statements again. The $5,000 donation to Hope for Tomorrow still gnawed at me. Why hadn't Daniel told me? He'd always been impulsive with money. Vintage motorcycles, unnecessary upgrades to his home office, but nothing like this. And then there were the other anomalies I'd noticed over the past few months. Mail redirected to a P.O. box instead of our home address. Cash withdrawals just below the threshold that would trigger our bank's alerts. $500 here, $700 there. Investment opportunities, he'd explained vaguely when I'd asked. Sometimes you need liquidity for the right moment. I'd nodded then, pretending to accept his excuses, but now they felt hollow, rehearsed. I opened a drawer in my desk and pulled out a small wooden box where I kept mementos. Ticket stubs from our first date, a pressed flower from our wedding bouquet, a letter Daniel had written me on our 5th anniversary. I unfolded the letter, the creases worn from years of handling. His handwriting was bold, confident, just like him. "Ellie, my love," it began. "I promise to always protect you, to stand by you, to build a life where you never have to fear. You're my everything." I traced the words with my fingertip, tears welling in my eyes. Had it all been a lie? Or had something changed him? Something I couldn't see? I wiped my eyes and set the letter aside, forcing myself to focus. Crying wouldn't help me now. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I began digging deeper, pulling up every financial record I could access, credit card statements, bank logs, even the activity on our shared Amazon account. That's when I found it. A separate credit card, one I'd never seen before. Linked to our joint account with significant monthly payments, thousands of dollars in charges, restaurants, hotels, boutiques, none of which I recognized. Work expenses, he'd said when I'd asked about smaller discrepancies before. The company reimburses me. But these weren't work expenses. They were personal, lavish, My phone buzzed again, startling me. Another text from the unknown number. Check his P.O. box, you'll see. My heart pounded as I stared at the message. Who was this? A friend? An enemy? Someone Daniel had crossed? I didn't know, but I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my coat and car keys, my mind racing as I headed for the door. Daniel had a P.O. box at a small post office in downtown Seattle. Something he'd set up a few months ago, claiming it was for work correspondence. I'd never questioned it before. Now, I needed to see what he was hiding. The drive to the post office was a blur, my thoughts a tangle of fear and anger. I parked and walked inside, the clerk giving me a curious glance as I asked to access the box. I'm Daniel Harper's wife, I said, showing my ID and a copy of our marriage certificate I kept in my wallet for emergencies. The clerk hesitated, but eventually handed me the key. My hands shook as I opened the box, revealing a stack of letters and packages. Most were innocuous, bills, junk mail, but one envelope caught my eye. It was from Hope for Tomorrow, the same organization Daniel had donated to. I tore it open, my breath catching as I read the contents, a thank you letter for his generous contribution signed by a woman named Sophia Bennett. The name meant nothing to me, but the tone of the letter felt too personal, too familiar. I shoved the letter into my purse, my mind spinning. Who was Sophia Bennett? Why was her name tied to this mysterious charity? And why had Daniel gone to such lengths to keep it from me? As I drove home, the weight of what I'd found pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I didn't have all the answers yet. But one thing was clear, my husband was hiding more than I'd ever imagined, and I needed to find out why before it was too late. The letter from Sophia Bennett burned a hole in my purse as I drove back from the post office, the Seattle skyline fading into a gray blur against the drizzle that had begun to fall. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as questions swirled in my mind like a storm I couldn't outrun. Who was Sophia? Why had Daniel donated $5,000 to her organization without telling me? And why did the tone of her thank you letter feel so intimate? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg, that beneath the surface of our carefully constructed life, something darker was lurking. Back home, I locked the door behind me and triple-checked the deadbolt, a habit born from the cryptic text I'd received earlier that morning. Be careful with your husband. He's not who you think he is. The words echoed in my head, each syllable laced with menace. I pulled the letter out of my purse and spread it on the kitchen island, smoothing the creases, as if that might reveal some hidden truth. Hope for tomorrow, the letterhead read, with a small logo of a rising sun. The thank you note was polite, professional even, but there was a familiarity in the phrasing. Dear Daniel, your generosity means the world to us. That set my nerves on edge. I opened my laptop and typed the organization's name into Google again, but the sparse website offered little beyond a mission statement about cancer research and a donation form. No staff list, no contact details beyond a generic email. It felt like a front, a facade. And I'd seen enough in my career to know when something didn't add up. I pushed the letter aside and returned to my banking app, my fingers moving with a precision that belied the chaos in my mind. As a risk management consultant, I'd spent years identifying patterns of fraud, and now I applied that same methodical approach to my own life. I logged into my personal accounts, the ones Daniel shouldn't have had access to, and began a comprehensive audit. At first glance, everything seemed normal. No unauthorized withdrawals, no unusual activity. But when I dug deeper into my primary savings account, the one I'd kept separate since we married, I found something that made my blood run cold. Someone had attempted to add a new authorized user, Daniel Harper, with full access privileges. The request had been made online using my credentials, but was pending approval via a phone call from the bank, a call I hadn't received. My heart pounded as I dialed the bank's fraud department, my voice steadier than I felt. This is Eleanor Harper, I said, giving my account number. I need to report a potential issue. The representative, a kind woman named Linda, confirmed my suspicions. A change request had been initiated the previous day, attempting to add Daniel as an account holder. "Would you like to approve this request, Miss Harper?" she asked. "Absolutely not," I replied, my tone sharp. "In fact, I need to report potential identity theft. I didn't initiate this request." The implications hit me like a tidal wave. Daniel wasn't just being secretive, he was actively trying to gain access to my personal assets without my consent. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected, leaving me breathless with its magnitude. Linda was efficient, helping me lock down my accounts, change all passwords, and place fraud alerts on my credit. "You should file a police report," she advised, her voice gentle but firm. "Even if you don't want to press charges, it creates an official record." I thanked her but hesitated. Filing a police report against my own husband felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. A line I wasn't ready to face, not yet. Despite everything, some part of me still clung to the hope that there was an explanation, a misunderstanding that could salvage the ruins of our marriage. That hope evaporated later that night. I'd just finished setting up two-factor authentication on all my accounts when my phone rang, the screen flashing an unknown number. It was 11:47 p.m. Far too late for a casual call. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button, but something, instinct, curiosity, fear, made me answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause, then a voice, low, raspy, unrecognizable, spoke. "Stop what you're doing," it said. "If you don't, you'll regret it." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone, my heart slamming against my ribs. I dropped the phone onto the couch and backed away, as if it might come alive again. The house felt suddenly too big, too exposed, the shadows in the corners darker than they'd ever been. I checked the locks again, turned on every light, and even dragged a chair against the front door for good measure. Sleep was out of the question, so I spent the next hour researching local security companies, booking an appointment to install additional locks and cameras the next day. I also called a private security firm I'd worked with on a corporate case last year and hired a guard to patrol the house for the next few nights. It felt paranoid, excessive even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That whoever had called knew more than I did. The next morning, I reached out to Rachel Coleman, a forensic accountant I'd collaborated with on several fraud cases. "Financial deception between spouses is more common than you think," Rachel said over the phone, her tone matter-of-fact but empathetic. "But attempting to gain unauthorized access to accounts? That's crossing into criminal territory. We need to move fast." With her guidance, I spent the day implementing safeguards, transferring funds from my compromised accounts to new ones at different banks, freezing my credit, and setting up advanced authentication protocols. I also gathered my most important financial documents, tax returns, investment statements, deeds, and secured them in a safe deposit box at a bank where Daniel had no ties. Rachel also suggested setting up a decoy, a financial honeypot, as she called it. "Create a dummy account with a small balance," she explained. "Make it look valuable but not catastrophic if accessed. If he tries to touch it, you'll have proof of intent." I followed her advice, opening a new account with $10,000, enough to seem tempting but not enough to ruin me, and deliberately left the login information in a notebook on my desk, written in a shorthand system I knew Daniel could decipher if he tried. It was a trap, one I hoped he'd fall into, but the waiting felt like torture. As the day wore on, exhaustion settled into my bones, but my mind refused to rest. The anonymous call replayed in my head, a sinister counterpoint to the image of Daniel photographing my banking details. Was he behind the call? Or was someone else involved? Someone connected to Sophia Bennett, perhaps? I didn't know, but I couldn't stop now. I had to protect myself, even if it meant unraveling the life we'd built together. Because if there was one thing I'd learned from my mother's heartbreak, it was this: love couldn't save you from ruin. Only you could do that. The days that followed felt like a masquerade, each moment a performance I had to perfect. I smiled at Daniel over dinner, laughed at his jokes, and nodded along as he talked about his latest tech project, all while my heart pounded with the weight of what I knew. Behind the facade, I was watching, waiting. My every move calculated to protect myself from the man I'd once trusted with my life. The decoy account I'd set up with Rachel's guidance sat like a ticking bomb, its login information deliberately left in a notebook on my desk, a notebook I knew Daniel could access if he tried. I'd written the details in a shorthand system we'd both used early in our marriage for shared grocery lists and travel plans, a system I was certain he'd recognize. It was a trap, and I needed him to take the bait. I maintained the illusion of normalcy, but inside I was unraveling. The anonymous call from that late night still haunted me. "Stop what you're doing, or you'll regret it," its raspy voice echoing in my sleepless hours. I'd fortified the house with new locks, additional cameras, and a security guard who patrolled the perimeter at night, but the fear lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. Who had called me? Was it Daniel trying to scare me into submission? Or someone else, someone tied to Sophia Bennett and her mysterious Hope for Tomorrow organization? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Each morning, I checked the decoy account for activity, my fingers trembling as I logged in. For the first week, there was nothing, just the $10,000 balance sitting untouched, a silent taunt. I began to wonder if I'd misjudged him, if maybe Daniel's actions had an explanation I hadn't considered. But then, 10 days after I'd set the trap, I got the alert I'd been both dreading and expecting. A transaction. $3,500 charged to a luxury resort in Napa Valley, booked for the following month. The reservation was for two, and my name wasn't on it. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen, the betrayal slicing deeper with every detail. I casually mentioned the weekend to Daniel that evening over dinner. "I was thinking of joining you for that work conference next month. Maybe we could make a trip out of it." Watching his reaction closely, he didn't even blink. "Bad timing, unfortunately," he said, slicing into his steak with precision. "I'll be in back-to-back meetings with potential clients. You wouldn't see much of me." The lie came so smoothly, I almost admired his audacity. The Napa charge was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, the decoy account became a floodgate of reckless spending. $65,000 on high-end electronics, $8,500 at designer boutiques, $3,500 for first-class tickets to Cabo San Lucas. The amounts were staggering, the pace frenzied, as if Daniel feared the access might vanish at any moment. Each transaction felt like a slap, a confirmation of the betrayal I'd feared but hadn't wanted to believe. He maintained an impeccable facade at home, sharing meals, watching movies, even planning a weekend getaway to celebrate our upcoming anniversary. But the disconnect between his actions and his demeanor was dizzying. How could he sit across from me, laughing over a glass of wine, while draining what he thought was my life's savings? I documented everything meticulously, saving screenshots of each transaction, cross-referencing them with dates and times Daniel had been working late. Rachel reviewed the activity weekly, her voice grim over the phone. "He's escalating faster than I expected," she said. "This isn't just opportunistic spending, it's systematic liquidation." The question is why? Michael Evans, the attorney I'd consulted, echoed her concern. "After 15 years, what triggered this? We need to dig deeper, Ellie. Build an airtight case before you confront him." I agreed, but the waiting was excruciating. The uncertainty gnawed at me, making sleep elusive and concentration impossible. Who was the second person on the Napa reservation? Was it Sophia Bennett, the woman whose name had appeared in the Hope for Tomorrow letter? And what was her connection to Daniel? Business or something more? I hired a private investigator through Michael's recommendation to look into Sophia, hoping for answers that might explain Daniel's sudden descent into deceit. Then came the second layer of escalation, a discovery that hit me like a punch to the gut. While reviewing the latest transactions on the decoy account, I noticed an unusual charge, $12,000 for an item purchased through an online auction house. The description was vague, antique musical instrument, but my curiosity got the better of me. I contacted the auction house, posing as Daniel's assistant to request details. When the email response arrived, my breath caught in my throat. It was a vintage Steinway piano, circa 1950, identical in make and model to the one my mother had lost. The one that had been her sanctuary, the one whose absence had broken her. The auction house confirmed the purchase, noting it was a gift for someone special, with delivery instructions to a storage unit in Seattle. My mind reeled, memories of my mother's fingers on the keys flooding back with painful clarity. How did Daniel know about the piano? I'd told him the story early in our marriage, a quiet confession during a late-night conversation about our pasts, but had never mentioned the specific make or model. Had he remembered all this time? Was this his attempt at redemption, a way to heal the wounds he'd inflicted? Or was it just another lie, another manipulation to throw me off his trail? The possibility of both tore at me, leaving me suspended between hope and suspicion. That night, I received another email, this one from the private investigator I'd hired. The subject line read, "Urgent, Sophia Bennett background." I opened it with trembling hands, scanning the contents. Sophia wasn't just Daniel's assistant or charity organizer. She had ties to a known financial crime ring, one currently under investigation by the feds for money laundering and fraud. The investigator warned that Daniel might be involved, or worse, being manipulated by Sophia in ways that could endanger us both. If you confront him now, the email cautioned, you could provoke a dangerous reaction. Proceed with extreme caution. I sat back, my pulse racing, the piano, the spending, the threats. It was all spiraling out of control, a web of deceit I couldn't yet untangle. But one thing was clear, I couldn't keep waiting in the dark. I needed answers, and I needed them soon. Before the shadow over our lives grew too large to escape. The air in our Seattle home felt thick with tension as I sat in the living room, the folder of evidence on the coffee table before me like a loaded gun. Bank statements, security footage, screenshots of transactions, photos from the private investigator, all meticulously organized, a testament to my months of silent vigilance. But it wasn't just the folder that held my attention. In the corner of the room stood the vintage Steinway piano I'd tracked down and purchased from the auction house, its polished mahogany gleaming under the soft light of the chandelier. I'd had it delivered that morning, a physical symbol of the past and the questions I needed answered. My heart pounded as I waited for Daniel to walk through the door, knowing that tonight the facade we'd both maintained would shatter. At 2:37 p.m., I heard the jingle of keys in the lock. Daniel stepped inside, his arms laden with shopping bags from high-end electronics stores, his face lit with a smug satisfaction that vanished the moment he saw me. "Ellie," he said, his voice tinged with surprise as he set the bags down in the entryway. "You're home early." "As are you," I replied, my tone calm despite the storm raging inside me. I nodded toward the bags. "Successful shopping trip?" He recovered quickly, a practiced smile spreading across his face. "Just some upgrades for my home office," he said, pulling a sleek box from one of the bags with obvious pride. "The consulting business is taking off. Thought I deserved to invest in proper equipment." "With my money," I said, my voice steady but cold. His smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone defensive. "I used my own funds." "No, Daniel," I said, standing and picking up the folder. "You used the credit card connected to the decoy account I created after I caught you photographing my banking information at 4 a.m. 3 weeks ago." The color drained from his face, but he rallied with a surprising indignation. "You've been spying on me, setting traps?" "Protecting myself," I corrected, my gaze unwavering. As it turns out, with good reason, I gestured toward the piano in the corner. "And this?" "What's this, Daniel?" "Who's it for?" "Someone special," the auction house said. "Is that Sophia Bennett? Or did you mean me?" His eyes widened as they landed on the piano, a mix of shock and something softer, regret maybe, crossing his face. For a moment he didn't speak, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with him. "Ellie," he began, his voice breaking, "that piano, it was for you." I froze, the words hitting me like a punch. "For me?" I echoed, my voice trembling despite my resolve. After everything you've done? Stealing from me? Lying to me? You expect me to believe that? He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes, the first I'd seen in years. I remembered the story you told me, he said, his voice raw, about your mother's piano, how much it meant to her, to you. I thought if I could get it back for you, it might fix things. Before everything spiraled out of control. Then why the lies? I demanded, my own tears threatening to spill. Why the secret accounts, the spending, the trips with Sophia? Why didn't you just talk to me? He took a shuddering breath and the floodgates opened. I'm sick, Ellie, he said, the words spilling out like a confession. Lymphoma, diagnosed 6 months ago. The treatments are experimental, expensive, more than our insurance covers. I didn't want to burden you. I stared at him, the revelation knocking the air from my lungs. Burden me? I whispered. I'm your wife, Daniel. We could have faced this together. He shook his head, his eyes haunted. I couldn't. Not after Sophia got involved. She works with hope for tomorrow, or at least, that's what I thought at first. But she's tied to something bigger, something dangerous. She knew about my illness, my past mistakes, a financial deal I botched early in my career that could ruin me if it went public. She used it against me, pushed me to take your money, to fund her schemes, the trips, the spending. It was all part of her plan. But the piano, that was mine. For you, I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. The private investigator's warning echoed in my head. Sophia's ties to a financial crime ring, the danger she posed. Part of me wanted to believe Daniel, to cling to the idea that he'd been manipulated, that some piece of the man I'd loved remained, but the evidence in the folder told a different story. One of systematic betrayal, of Napa weekends and Cabo flights with Sophia. What about her, I asked, my voice barely audible. You and Sophia, what is she to you? He flinched as if I'd struck him. It started as business, he admitted. But it became more. I was scared, Ellie, scared of dying, scared of losing everything. She offered an escape, a distraction. I was weak. The admission broke something inside me, a final fracture in the foundation of our marriage. I handed him the folder, my hands steady now. This is a comprehensive accounting of your fraud, I said evenly. Bank statements, security footage, photos of you with Sophia. I've prepared divorce papers. My terms are generous. You keep your assets, I keep mine. No alimony. But if you fight me, this goes to the police, the DA, and your employer. He flipped through the pages, his face contorted with disbelief. You've thought of everything, he murmured, his voice hollow. I'm so sorry, Ellie. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said, standing. I loved you, Daniel, but I won't let you destroy me. The weeks that followed were a blur. The divorce was finalized with surprising efficiency, Daniel signing the papers without a fight. He moved out, leaving me with a house full of memories I couldn't bear. But before I sold it, I did something for myself. I organized a small concert in the living room, inviting a handful of close friends, and played my mother's favorite Chopin nocturne on the Steinway piano. As my fingers moved over the keys, tears streamed down my face. Not just for the marriage I'd lost, but for the woman I'd found again. The melody felt like a bridge to my mother, a reminder of her strength, her love, her lessons. I accepted a promotion in Portland, a fresh start in a new city. With the proceeds from the house, I founded the Piano Fund, a small charity to help women rebuild their financial lives after betrayal. It was my way of turning pain into purpose, of honoring my mother's memory. Meanwhile, I learned through news reports that Daniel had turned state's witness against Sophia, helping dismantle her criminal network. It spared him prison, but it didn't undo the past. As I walked out of my Portland office one evening, my phone buzzed with a notification. A donation to the Piano Fund, Anonymous, but with a note. Keep playing. I smiled, the weight of the past lifting just a little. I'd survived, I'd rebuilt, and I'd found my own song again.